Helen Charman was a local girl. She was born in Headley. She was working in service for the Vicar of Kingswood and his family when she met a Sussex-born farm worker, Alfred Hillman. He was a carter, which meant that he drove any kind of two-wheeled contraption on the farm, and that usually included being the ploughman as well. We have a lovely photograph of him, an action shot of him ploughing from the mid-1900s. He came up to this area presumably to find work. I mean, these workers were always forever on the move. Every 2 or 3 seasons they'd move on somewhere new. Now he came up to Walton on the hill, and it was there presumably that they met, and they had 3 sons born there. They lost the first of their sons very early on in infancy, and Helen was actually pregnant with their second son when she lost her first. But a couple of years later, Jack came along. He was born on the 13th of July, 1899, when the family were living at Mint Cottage in Walton on the Hill. He was baptised at St Peter's. As I said, they were already on the move, or forever on the move, and it wasn't long before they moved again, and they went to Park Farm. Not Park Farm in Banstead, but Park Farm in Chipstead. And the park that they moved to that was there was Upper Gatton Park. The Great Gatton estate was cut in half by the M25 now. But the main building is still there, although much altered. And the cottages that they would have lived in, the Hillmans would have lived in, are probably still survive to this day. Now they moved again very shortly afterwards, and they came to Banstead then, to Mint Cottages, and then their 4th child, daughter, Helen, was born. Mint Cottages are some of the oldest buildings, surviving buildings in Banstead. They're of mid-Victorian period, a row of brick and flint cottages up by the Mint pub. Unfortunately, we don't know which one they lived in. Alfred was probably working at either Mint Farm, which was at the end of the Mint Road, or at Place Farm, which was at the Park Road end of Mint Road, probably working as a ploughman and a carter. Why he came up here? Well, he had relatives here as well. He had an older brother, Jesse, who was also a carter and ploughman, and he was living in Heath. We don't know which one of them came here first, but presumably with one of them here, the other followed. And Jesse used to live in Elm Cottages, which are still there today, number 513 and 515 on Reigate Road, just up by Asda at the Heath. He was a ploughman on the Nork estate, and it's funny to think that the field that he was ploughing at the time later housed the school that his great niece Jill went to, Nork Park. So the Hillmans were agricultural workers. They lived, our village was changing into a commuter town, but most of our men at that point were still agriculturally employed. And they moved from Mint Cottages to Park Farm in Holly Lane. Park Farm was the home farm for the Garton family's Banstead Wood estate. There were a few cottages around there. They had a chauffeur's cottage, a lodge at the end of the drive, which is still there today, and cottages for their farm workers. Sadly, the cottages that the Hillmans were living in have been demolished several decades ago, but there are still houses down there to this day. Jack went to school in the village. His younger sister Helen, known as Nellie, remembers the walk to school and remembered Jack giving her a lift on the handlebars of his bike. She described him as a lively and likeable character, popular with the girls. He used to play football with the boys in the field down near Park Farm. He was, as I said earlier, musically talented. She said he could get a note out of anything, and he helped teach her the violin. He played the trumpet in Banstead's town band, later known as Banstead Prize Band, when they started winning silverware. So they were a marching brass band that wore military-style uniforms. They were around for several years before the outbreak of the First World War, and they were a fixture at any social occasion and event in the village and the surrounding area. They made notable competitive appearance at the 22nd annual marching band contest down at Hawley, when they carried off the silver prize just a couple of years before war broke out. And when war eventually did break out, they had a part to play too. And they, for example, they gave concerts in Redhill to raise money for families distressed as a result of the war. And Jack probably played with them when they did so. Jack, after he left school, became a gardener. His older brother, William, was a gardener up at Place Farm, near where the family had used to live. And Jack seems to have followed him up there. Now, William went off to war in 1915. He enlisted under the Derby scheme, joined the 1st Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment. He went off to have quite a bad war, really. He was wounded 3 times, severely at least twice, and ended up losing one of his legs as a result. He became the caretaker for Banstead Church Institute after the war. So Jack followed William into this role. As the war went on, more and more men had to be found to go overseas, and chauffeurs like William Gudgeon were impressed upon by their employers, who in turn were being pressured by organisations like the AA and the RAC and civic society as a whole to let their men go and let their chauffeurs go. Tell them that they're going to be, promise them to keep their jobs open, perhaps even keep paying their wages. These chauffeurs were given an incentive to join. They were given pretty good pay. They were sold on army life being glamorous and not at all dangerous because they were going to be far from the line. That women love a guy in uniform, all this sort of stuff. It proved to be a very successful campaign, and a lot of these chauffeurs went off, and their places were taken by old men, old retired footmen, or boys. And it seems that Jack was one of these boys, because when he eventually joined the army, he was described as a driver. Now, Jack was far too young to serve when war broke out. He was only about 15 or so. But the family tell that he received a white feather anyway through the post. A rather despicable trend that was particularly prevalent in the autumn of 1914, but thankfully subsided after that. A semi-organised campaign by some fairly wealthy ladies or young ladies who would send white feathers to men that they considered were shirking. And the family story is that Jack was so outraged by this, so offended by the suggestion that he was a coward, that he joined the army virtually on the spot and went off to serve. That's not quite true, but there is a germ of truth in that. He was still too young to serve as the war progressed. He didn't turn 18 until the summer of 1917. And when he was called up, when he was conscripted, he didn't drag his feet, and that's perhaps where the family story about joining the army does tie back into what actually happened. He didn't drag his feet, and 10 days before his 18th birthday, he was attested down at Epsom, and he joined the Royal Fusiliers. Quite short, 5 foot 4.5 tall, weighing 8.5 stone. His older brother was about 5 foot 4 tall, so quite a short family. He became a bugler, or he actually became a drummer, because the drummers, as well as playing the drums, they played the bugle and the pipe. The drums to keep time on the march, and the bugles to give orders on the battlefield. Or by the time he did see the battlefield, that had virtually been discontinued, apart from some occasional, very famous instances of buglers sounding the charge that did happen throughout the war. One of his main duties, apart from keeping the daily routine going in the camp, would probably have been to act as an air raid warden. In the day before sirens, the buglers were quite often given duties to spot the German bombers, and they'd blow a warning if they were coming. So Jack trained on the home front, and he could have expected not to have gone out to France by now, as it were, 100 years ago, because you had to be 19 to go and serve overseas. And so he trained for several months. But in March 100 years ago, there was a crisis. The Germans attacked. They drove British Fifth Army back towards Amiens. British Fifth Army suffered horrendous casualties. Their line bent, it didn't break, but reinforcements were urgently needed, and so a change in military regulations was introduced. And that cut the age of overseas service from 19 years to 18 and a half. And that perhaps is where the story of Jack going to war too young comes from, because he was in one of the first batches of 18-year-olds to go. His younger sister Nellie remembered that when he came home for his final leave, just before he left, he refused to let his parents walk with him down the lane to the station, and he only took her with him, a walk she remembered for the rest of her life. He went to France at the very end of March, just about a week after the German advance had started. And by the 2nd of April, he'd been assigned to a battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, the 26th, the Bankers Battalion, originally raised for bank workers and city clerks by the Lord Mayor of London, but now just a general service battalion for anybody, really. Anybody, whenever they needed reinforcements, they'd just grab anybody. And 400 young men, most of them Jack's age, went to join them in one batch of reinforcements. That's how bad the casualties were at the beginning of April. We'd stopped the Germans down in France, and this badly damaged battalion had been sent up to Belgium for a rest. They went to Passchendaele for a rest. It seems funny now, but the fighting there had been over for several months by that point. And Jack's first tour of duty in the line was actually at just north of Passchendaele, this ruined craterscape. I don't know what he must have made of it. I mean, just a place as infamous as that, even by 1918, let alone the reputation it's gained after the war, must have been an extremely frightening place to be. Many of the men he was with, however, were veterans of that Passchendaele campaign. It must have seemed so strange to them. They'd left the battlefield before they'd captured Passchendaele. So strange to be up there after all those months of fighting and virtually not a German to be seen, and how bitterly disappointing when just a week later they had to start withdrawing from Passchendaele and falling back towards Ypres, because we'd overextended ourselves in that campaign of 1917. We'd left ourselves with a long curve of line, a salient, to hold, which now the Germans were making inroads into our lines to the south, was looking increasingly vulnerable. We had to shorten that line. So, like the secret Gallipoli withdrawal, we withdrew in secret. We left the line at Passchendaele held by a skeleton crew, and the rest of the men withdrew in secret halfway back to Ypres. And so while some East Surrey men held that front line, Jack and the rest of his battalion of Royal Fusiliers moved silently through the night back to new positions halfway back to Ypres. They were around a place called White Chateau. It was a newly built defensive line, and they were doing a lot of work all the time, strengthening those positions, waiting for the moment when the Germans discovered that there were virtually no troops in front of them and started to advance to follow them. And so they did. And eventually the Germans came up to meet with Jack's new position. That in turn became an outpost line, and more men withdrew back to stronger positions that had been arranged behind them. There were clashes with the Germans. They launched, it was a series of offensives, not just the one big March offensive, but a series of offensives through April and May, and they got closer and closer to Jack and the Fusiliers, although they were not involved in any of the heavy fighting. The most activity they were involved in were conducting raids against the Germans, and they went out capturing prisoners, gathering intelligence, and that sort of thing. They spent an awful lot of their time resting, building defences, because we had several sets of fallback defences being constructed behind Ypres, because we felt further German offensive there was inevitable as the Germans tried to drive a wedge between the British forces and the French, drive the British back towards the coast, so we had to evacuate or surrender even. After doing this for April and May, the Fusiliers were withdrawn for almost a month's worth of rest and training, trying to integrate all these young men in with their more experienced counterparts, improve their probably quite rudimentary shooting skills on the range, those sorts of things, and practice as a battalion the attack, defence, night fighting, fighting in woods, and gearing themselves up for open warfare, either for the retreat that we might have to make if the Germans attacked, or for our eventual campaign, which would start in the summer and push the Germans back and finish the war. Now, the Germans continued to attack, and at the end of April, they captured a very important hill south of Ypres called Mont Kemmel. There are two twin hills south of Ypres, and they overlook the very flat ground around there, and they're both extremely important. Nestling between these two hills was a previously safe area full of lots of camps and huts where the men waiting to go into the salient were resting and training. The Germans captured the nearest of those two hills. So the men withdrew from the valley up to the second of these two hills, the Scherpenberg, and the Germans and the British and the French faced off across this wide, fairly shallow valley. The front line was improvised from all kinds of different scraps of trenches, old communications trenches, shell holes that were fortified, old railway lines, all these sorts of things that ran through the shattered remains of these camps. And that ran down the centre of the valley. And at the beginning of July, the Fusiliers moved into trenches in that valley. They had a stretch of about 500 yards to hold, ran from a camp up on their right, which ran down a shallow incline, about 500 yards, with an old light railway line with presumably an embankment which the men could hide behind, and down to Fairy House Camp, an old training camp. And they had 3 companies holding the front line and another company behind them. A very dangerous place to be. There was an awful lot of shelling because it was observed, well, for both sides very dangerous because it was observed from either side by these hills, one British and one German, so an awful lot of shelling and casualties as a result of that. On the 13th of July, Jack was in the line when he turned 19, and to celebrate his birthday, at 1 a.m. they launched a raid on the German, well, not to celebrate his birthday, but if you see what I mean. They launched a raid at 1 a.m. and took 2 prisoners. They were still in the line 100 years ago today, on the 14th of July, which is Jack's official date of death. But there's very good reason to believe that he wasn't killed today. Tomorrow, the 15th of July, 100 years ago, was the last day in the line for the Fusiliers, and they withdrew after that on the 16th to support positions on the slopes of this hill that was behind them, the Scherpenberg. And it's there that Jack is buried, or was buried originally, in a makeshift grave marked by a cross. The casualties in the front line tended to be lost, and they went on the memorial to the missing, whereas the 3 young Fusiliers, all 19 years old, who are supposed to have died on the 14th of July, were buried where the battalion was 2 days later, on the 16th of July. Jack was reburied after the war in La Clitte military cemetery, not too far away from where he fell. He left no epitaph, just memories.
Father of all, remember your promise and look with love on all your people, living and departed. On this day, we especially remember Jack Hillman and ask that you would hold forever him and all who suffered during the First World War, those who returned scarred by warfare, those who waited anxiously at home, and those who returned wounded and disillusioned, those who mourned, and those communities that were diminished and suffered loss. Remember too those who acted with kindly compassion, those who bravely risked their own lives for their comrades, and those who in the aftermath of war worked tirelessly for a more peaceful world. And as you remember them, remember us. O Lord, grant us peace in our time, and a longing for the day when people of every language, race and nation will be brought into the unity of Christ's kingdom. This we ask in the name of the same Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Yeah. As our Saviour taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Would you please stand?
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today.
God, grant the living grace, the departed rest, the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, and all the world peace and concord. And to us and all God's servants, life everlasting. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you always. Amen.
Amen.
chauffeur.
The chauffeur.
They should grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. But going down of the sun and in the moon, we will remember them. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today.